The official legal system never gave Black Mississippians a fair trial, and white mobs often took justice into their own hands. When Black Mississippians violated the racial hierarchy of Jim Crow society, white supremacists responded with violence, including public lynchings, executions. White people from all classes gathered to watch mobs torture and hang Black people. Often whites justified lynchings by claiming that victims had raped a white woman. But these accusations were almost always false. Although some white leaders spoke out against violence, the majority of white society felt that lynchings were necessary to maintain the social order and control African Americans. When critics in the North complained about lynchings, Mississippi officials responded by blaming Black people for not understanding their place in Southern society. The Mississippi governor stated this: "This is strictly a white man's country. If the Northern Negro lover wants to stop Negro lynchings in the South, he must first get the right conception of the proper relation that must necessarily exist between the races and teach and train the Negro race along these lines and in this way remove the cause of lynching." Violence and fear were part of everyday life for African Americans living in Mississippi during the Jim Crow era. Between 1889 and 1945, at least 476 people were lynched in Mississippi, more than any other state in the country. Of those, 439 were Black men. Lynching made Black political activism extremely dangerous. How did African Americans in rural Mississippi make a living during Jim Crow? While a small number of African Americans owned farms in the Jim Crow era, 85% of African Americans worked on land owned by white planters, most as sharecroppers. The sharecropping life was very difficult. Although some landowners treated tenants fairly, many exploited them, using fraud, racist laws, and threats of violence to maintain control over their plantations. Men, women, and children had to work long hours during peak seasons. Women often worked doubly hard, tending to the fields and the household at the same time. Sharecropping families often spent most of their earnings paying down debts they had accumulated during the year. Merchants imposed high interest rates on sharecroppers who had to buy most of their products on credit until the harvest payout. Some landlords deliberately cheated the sharecroppers when calculating their earnings. In the end, very few Black sharecroppers earned enough money to buy their own land. Most remained stuck in a state of economic dependency, not unlike slavery. One sharecropper in 1935 stated this: "Just work all the year long, and at the end of the year, what they say, 'You done fine, Jim or John. You come out just even. Maybe you do better next year.'" What was life like for African Americans living in cities? The majority of Black Mississippians lived in the countryside, but the Black population in cities and towns increased fivefold between 1890 and 1940 as African Americans began looking for work in growing southern cities. While they were often better off than sharecroppers, African Americans living in urban areas were usually only able to get jobs that whites considered the least desirable. They worked as servants, gardeners, cooks, janitors, porters, and bellhops. Black men did some of the most difficult and dangerous work in cities, including factory work, construction, and maintenance. Black women were domestic workers in the homes of wealthy and middle-class whites. When whites and blacks did perform the same jobs, for example as teachers, whites received far better pay. Jim Evers, the father of the civil rights leader Medgar and Charles Evers, stated this: "All the good jobs are for white folks, and the hard ones are for Black folks." Skilled jobs were limited for African Americans in Mississippi during the early 20th century. Many whites refused to hire Black carpenters and builders. Black professionals were also rare, and they usually worked exclusively within the Black community. For example, Black doctors could only count on Black patients for their business. Black lawyers had been relatively commonplace during Reconstruction, but by 1900 there were few still practicing. Judges often excluded Black attorneys from their courtrooms, and the state's White Bar Association frequently tried to revoke Black lawyers' licenses. What educational opportunities did African Americans receive under Jim Crow? Without representation in state government, Black Mississippians received very few public services. Black students were taught in separate inferior schools, often in log cabins, churches, or stores, because the school buildings were so run down. No state spent as little on the education of Black children as Mississippi. By 1930, the Mississippi government was spending an average of $31.33 per year on each white student, but only $5.49 on each black student. Despite the lack of state support, Black Mississippians believed that education was key to improving their situation. They often raised funds among themselves and collected donations from Northern philanthropists to raise money for schoolhouses and supplies. Black teachers developed innovative ways of teaching with few resources and were often highly respected members of the Black community. All the Black folks understood that their passport to a better community was a good education. It was a general position of my parents and other parents of that generation that if we got an education, we would be free. Stated by James Miller, a Black Mississippian, in 1994.